I'm going to talk about the fate of type 4, and I believe Rachel's going to give more of an overview of the various types. Hans Frei's major publications are largely concerned to secure what he calls the literal sense of biblical narratives, in particular, those about Jesus. However, what he means by the literal sense, or the sensus literalis, is not always entirely clear. What he intends to rule out often emerges more clearly than what he intends to rule in. In some of his early writings, what he mainly wants to rule out is a merely symbolic reading of Jesus. The narrated Jesus, Frei will say, has an unsubstitutable identity. He does not stand for anything other than himself. In the gospel narratives, Jesus is not merely a moral symbol, a la Kant, nor a symbol of life-transforming spirituality, a la Tillich, nor even of some clever combination of the two, a la Troeltsch. The narrative depiction of Jesus in the Gospels may or may not be true. Nevertheless, as a matter of logic, argues Frei, the truth question needs to be kept distinct from the meaning question. The meaning of the narratives is not determined by whether their rendering of Jesus is true. Meaning and truth are two separate issues, and when it comes to the truth question, the risen Christ can take care of himself. Frei's understanding of the sensus literalis, which pertains mainly to the question of meaning, shifts over time. It shifts from his early emphasis on the literal sense as a property of the gospel texts to his later view that it is more nearly a communal judgment about how to read the texts, to his final and less well-known conviction that this communal judgment is ratified by authoritative ecumenical councils, especially the Council of Chalcedon. In short, it may be said that Frei's understanding undergoes a shift from the sensus literalis as a textual property to the sensus communalis to the sensus conciliorum. Frei initially believed that a narrative analysis of the Gospels would yield a high Christology. Because the Gospels conclude by narrating the death and resurrection of Jesus in his unadorned singularity, and because in this narration the interrelation of divine and human activity is set forth as a complex matter of unity in distinction, the actions of Jesus and the actions of God are mysteriously depicted as one while remaining distinct. Nevertheless, Frei does not yet succeed in his project of securing a high Christology. In his early work, he handles only one of its elements successfully. His analysis of how the gospel stories depict Jesus as a particular person who cannot be substituted for anyone or anything else regarding his saving significance is reasonably convincing. He does not succeed, however, as he would like to do, in explaining how Jesus, as a particular person, can have universal saving significance. Nor does he succeed in showing just how Jesus' saving significance rests on what he calls a pattern of exchange. But without these two latter elements, there can be no high Christology. The early Frei's two patterns of identity depiction, which he calls respectively the intention-action scheme and the self-manifestation scheme, both tend to militate against a high Christology. They give us only a Jesus who is fully human, but not one who is fully divine. In a high Christology, however, it is ordinarily the deity of Jesus that not only makes his saving significance to be universal in scope, but that also makes intelligible the pattern of exchange between fallen humanity and the one who is righteousness itself, what certain early Greek theologians like Origen sometimes called autodukaiosune. By his own admission, however, the identity depiction schemes that the early Frei uses function only to describe Jesus as a full human being. They are ill-equipped to portray him as anything more. In short, in his early writings, Frei offers a convincing account of Jesus' unsubstitutable particularity, but arguably fails to establish his universal saving significance. Frei fails to establish that in his narrated identity, Jesus is truly God. Consequently, he cannot sustain his account of the pattern of exchange, which requires that Jesus have universal significance for the good of others. Although in his book, The Identity of Jesus Christ, Frei wishes to propound a high Christology, he succeeds in establishing only one of its three defining elements by means of a narrative analysis: unadorned particularity at the expense of universality and the saving exchange between the righteous one and the sinful many. In an essay written prior to his identity book, Frei discusses the Christology of H. Richard Niebuhr in light of the Calcedonian formula. He notes with approval that in the book Christ and Culture, Niebuhr propounds a moral analysis of the Incarnation as opposed to a metaphysical analysis. Rather than focusing on Jesus' divine and human natures in their mysterious unity in distinction, Niebuhr seeks to expound Jesus' divine-human union solely in terms of his moral historical acts. The result, Frei suggests, points toward a unique moral sonship in which Jesus is completely one with God's will while also being completely one with human beings. This oneness is said to be moral and volitional, as opposed to metaphysical or ontological. Frei describes Niebuhr's approach as an important and fruitful new suggestion in modern theology, which holds every promise of being useful. It is intriguing to think that Frei might have conceived of his identity book as an attempt to expound upon Niebuhr's suggestion. Like Niebuhr, he seems to think that Christology should focus on Jesus' deeds as opposed to his natures. Frei would thus be drawing positively upon his teacher, not just possibly attempting to correct him. It is instructive, however, that in pursuing such a program, Frei is unable to provide a convincing account of a high or Calcedonian Christology. Rather than being mutually exclusive options, it seems that a moral Christology cannot be worked out in accord with Chalcedon without being developed as a metaphysical Christology at the same time. In his 1986 Princeton lectures, as found in the posthumous types of Christian theology, Frei returns to the problem of a high Christology in accord with Chalcedon. Although he has long since left his earlier Christological project behind, he has not lost his interest in the Christological significance of the gospel stories. Although they no longer serve as the sole basis for deriving a high Christology, he believes that the stories can be interpreted through the lens of the Calcedonian formula. It is an ecclesial committed interpretation, informed at once by both dogmatic and exegetical reflection. It presupposes, in effect, a complex feedback loop that moves dialectically from exegesis to dogmatics and back again in a continual process of dynamic interaction. The later Frei's insight into how the Calcedonian formula functions as a hermeneutical device more nearly than as a direct metaphysical proposal is perhaps the most compelling suggestion for its use that I have seen. The formula he writes in the Types book is a conceptual redescription of a synthesis of the gospel stories understood as narratives identifying Jesus Christ. The gospel stories, the later Frei now suggests, are to be read through Calcedon as a hermeneutical or interpretive scheme. Just because some gospel episodes depict Jesus in his humanity, that does not mean that he is not truly God. Just because others depict him in his deity, that does not mean he is not truly human. When the human predication is in the forefront of the narrative, the divine is presupposed in the background. Likewise, when the divine predication is in the forefront, the human is tacitly affirmed. Faithful or ecclesial reading moves back and forth between these divergent predications without achieving a synthesis. The predications are held together by the story itself, not by metaphysical speculation. As Karl Barth points out, the full deity and full humanity of Jesus can neither be depicted simultaneously nor apprehended synoptically under a single unifying concept. When the one is heard, the other can be heard only indirectly, in faith. Faith is the perception either way of what is not said. In this way, the two opposing predications, the truly divine and the truly human, are held together by Jesus as a single unitary subject in the gospel stories. For Jesus as narrated, the unity of the predications receives priority over their abiding logical distinctness. What is at stake, Frei proposes, is the proper identification of the agent under a categorical scheme. The meaning is found in the story itself. In other words, the meaning of Calcedon is the narrated unity in distinction of the two predications about Jesus, not some metaphysical speculation beyond it. The meaning of the doctrine, Frei concludes, is the story, rather than the meaning of the story being the doctrine. What we encounter in types of Christian theology is the maturation of Frei's hermeneutical thought. He still proposes to read the gospel stories by identifying Jesus through a hermeneutical lens or conceptual scheme. The scheme is no longer regarded as a merely formal device, however, since Calcedon is at one level a first-order material utterance summarizing the apostolic witness to the mystery of Jesus' identity. Nor is this interpretive scheme derived from the gospel stories alone. It arises from the New Testament witness taken as a whole. As confessed by faith, it is ratified by an ecumenical council of the ancient church under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. It functions as an authoritative device to secure the literal sense of the New Testament witness to the person of Jesus. The Calcedonian formula thus authorizes and ensures the kind of high Christology with a narrative orientation that the early Frei had sought but never found. Although he takes many detours to get there, he arrives at Calcedon as his hermeneutical home. The result is a robust account of Jesus' unsubstitutable identity as confessed by faith. No one else will ever be God incarnate. No one else will ever die for the sins of the world. No one else will ever be God's self-revealing Word made flesh. And no one else will ever be a particular divine human person who is properly the object of worship. In types of Christian theology, the Calcedonian formula emerges as a fitting hermeneutical device for reading the New Testament as a whole, including the gospel narratives. Thank you.
I wonder, George, if you had taken into this historical trajectory those, I think, fairly early catechetical entries that he did with John Wolverton.
Yeah.
I wonder if this interest in the ecumenical creeds as not so much metaphysical description but authorization date back to those early catechetical essays.
So are those prior to the identity book?
I think they're not prior, but I think they're fairly close in time to them.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't know the chronology of those. I'm really talking about texts primarily. I mean, if he did something different in those lectures, that would be interesting. I think without my own senses, without quite knowing how to sort it all out, he was interested. I mean, he says he's interested in a high Christology, but that's in that essay called Remarks in Connection with the Theological Proposal, which he gave after he had published, I think, the Identity book, or at least after the Christian Scholar article, which is something like Remarks on the Death and Resurrection of Jesus or something, which is a less complicated text than the Identity book, even though the content is much the same. But I remember going through that piece, the Christian Scholar article, and wondering if there was something stronger in the direction of a high Christology in the Christian Scholar piece than in the Identity book. And so this would kind of confirm in a text what you're seeing in those catechetical lectures. And it's sparse, but he makes the same remark about Jesus' transition into powerlessness. And he says there, without giving it any grounding, it kind of comes out of nowhere if I don't misremember it, the transition is from omnipotence to powerlessness. Whoa, so, I mean, where does the omnipotence come from? See, it's very hard to get omnipotence out of those identity depictions that he took from Ryle. I mean, you can push it a little bit, but you can't get a robust deity of Christ out of those identity depictions. And he does say, I quoted him, he gives us a fully human Jesus. So there was a high Christology in there, but I think it was struggling to get out. And he wanted that formal identity depiction of just gospel narratives. And later on he said Calcedon looks at a synthesis of the narratives, and he's already got a synthesis in his mind in the early period, and it's mainly around Luke. But he wanted a high Christology, and he wanted a narrative analysis, and he called the identity book the hermeneutical bases of dogmatic reflection. But I think it was much more, indirectly and not very fully worked out, the dogmatic basis of hermeneutical reflection. There's a kind of tacit dogmatics influencing his reading that he just didn't make into a clear and distinct idea yet. But it's so fascinating. It's about 2.5 pages. I mean, it's not extensive in the types volume, where he goes to Calcedon. And I just quoted it sparsely, but it's a rich, dense way of thinking about how to make use of these conciliar decisions for reading the New Testament and the stories, and to make explicit what's implicit in them. But it's no longer derived from the stories themselves. So he may have had a somewhat richer and fuller set of doctrinal beliefs in his mind when he wrote those pieces for John Wolverton, but they didn't make it into the identity book, as far as I can see. And just to be raised from the dead doesn't make you have divine status. I mean, and he imports some aspects of divinity in there, but the H. Richard Niebuhr, well, the material that he says was a promising beginning the moral analysis of Jesus that he thinks is new. It's actually in Troeltsch. It's in Troeltsch's The Christian Faith. Troeltsch says something almost identical to that. And H. Richard, of course, thought of himself as trying to find some middle way between Barth and Troeltsch. But there was a lot more Troeltsch in there than there was Barth. And that's kind of indicated by the way in which H. Richard finally ended up with a book called Radical Monotheism, which I understand was partly in reaction against Barth's Trinitarianism and Christocentrism.
Thank you, George.
George, your very last sentence, it leads into what I want to ask you to do, whether we could tempt you to just continue this fascinating line of reflection in relation to Frei and the Trinity. You know, would you like to, you know, go beyond Christology to Frei and the Trinity? I'd love to hear you on that.
You know, that's a problem in modern Christology. It's much more Christocentric in one way or another than Trinitarian. And even when Karl Barth developed a robust doctrine of the Trinity, he didn't put it in the forefront of his theological discourse. He was more Christocentric rhetorically, not in terms of substance, I think, but he was more Christocentric rhetorically coming out of Schleiermacher, who he studied closely, than Trinitarian. So he definitely rehabilitated the doctrine of the Trinity for our time in a way that's still having its ongoing impact. You know, there's an explosion of books on the Trinity. After Barth wrote the Trinitarian section of Volume 1, Part 1 of the Church Dogmatics. So, yeah, I think that's definitely a way to go. And it's actually what John Webster was trying to do at the time when he died. You know, he was returning to Thomas Aquinas and trying to think about God's Trinitarian being in and for itself. And it was the for itself part that Barth gave acknowledgement to, but he didn't develop. So I think John Webster was trying to say that Trinity arises ase, the aseity of God is Trinitarian, so that God is Trinitarian in se, in himself, but then pro se. And it's the pro se side which really anchors the independence of God's being from the creation in order to make it a completely free act on God's part to enter into a relationship to the world, you know, from the Father through the Son and in the Spirit. So that's the direction I think one could take, you know, after Barth and after Frei, and kind of following along in the direction of John Webster. Webster was trying to give a Trinitarian account of the doctrine of creation. And before the pandemic kicked in, that's what I was trying to do too. I was trying to pick up where John Webster left off. And it's not easy to do. But yes, I think something like that is a really important project for the future, for the 21st century, let's say.
Thank you.
Yeah, Catherine.
Thanks, George. I was wondering whether, the high Christology, that, the commitment to a high Christology was present in the identity book in virtue of not just the way in which divine agency and human agency are talked about as coincident, but also in that it's the high Christology is being conveyed in virtue of the odd character of the narrative. So as I understand, I wish I had heard David Kelsey's remarks earlier, but as I understood the identity book, it wasn't simply making the claim about unsubstitutable identity as that was rendered by the narratives, but that there was, a very odd, which could be the case with any, say, novelistic depiction of a person, but that it was the weird referential force of the narrative, that the reality of Jesus, the presence of Jesus was being conveyed by the narrative, which was making the point about the high Christology, that this was a narrative unlike any other with the assumption being that, it was in virtue of the divine identity of Christ
I've worried about this question. I think you could make a case for it. David Kelsey went about as far as you could go in reading the identity book that way. But I did ask him in between sessions about this a little bit. In David's presentation, the word absolute and cognates is doing a lot of work. And he talked about the absolute singularity of Jesus and so on. And I said, well, does the word absolute actually appear in the identity book? And he said, no, it's his interpretation. Well, it's a fair interpretation, but I think you have to do a lot of work as a reader to take it in that direction. Even if Jesus is raised from the dead and present to us somehow, spiritually, it's not as robust a conception of Christ's deity as it would be if you start from Chalcedon. And if Jesus is truly God in the texts, I think he has to be regarded as the object of worship. And it's especially people like Richard Bauckham, who have, and not alone, but a bunch of recent interpreters, Bauckham, Martin Hengel, I think Francis Watson goes in this direction, Simon Gathercole, I mean, New Testament scholars, but they deal with texts that Frei doesn't engage with in the identity book. So, I mean, certainly you can read even the gospel narratives as setting forth the deity of Jesus more fully than you would learn or think just on the basis of Frei alone. In chapter 2 of the Gospel of Mark, it raises the question right away. I mean, Jesus forgives the sins of the man lowered through the roof, and the scribes, or the Pharisees in there too, the scribes and the Pharisees say he's committing blasphemy. He doesn't have, and of course they're right. He's committing blasphemy unless he isn't. That's the question that story is leaving us with. Does he really have the authority to forgive somebody's sins? I mean, this is one human being, apparently, forgiving the sins of another, and so assuming a divine prerogative to himself. And then the blasphemy question comes up at the very end of the Gospel of Mark, again, about riding on the clouds of heaven and so on. And he's accused of blasphemy again in the text. But Hans Frei doesn't deal with those elements in the identity of Jesus Christ. So it's because he wants some kind of formal identity description based on those categories he got from Ryle. And it's very hard to squeeze a robust sense of the deity of Christ out of those forms of identity, I think. I mean, he could be, well, I always felt myself, upon a reading of the identity, that it tended in a Nestorian direction. There was no kind of personal union, unio personalis. There was no hypostatic union of Jesus and God. It becomes manifest at the resurrection, and then somehow the two are one, and there's a distinction and an identity. But just to be raised from the dead, or even potentially spiritually present, all that presence stuff. If it is meant to put the deity of Christ before us, it's not a terribly robust sense of deity. And for me, the touchstone is, in any Christology, is this Jesus properly the object of worship? See, and that's what really comes through in some of this more recent New Testament scholarship that I mentioned, Larry Hurtado and Simon Gathercole. I mean, it's not that unusual. There's no consensus, of course, but as my New Testament colleague Dale Allison says, there's no consensus anywhere in New Testament scholarship. I mean, the question is this a view that has standing? Which means are there reputable scholars who think that Jesus is presented as the object of worship. I mean, even the verb for worship is disputed. But, some people, make an argument that, yes, Jesus is presented as a figure who's worthy of worship. And you can read in all four Gospels, not Mark, but in Matthew and Luke and John, it's really not until after the resurrection. There's a few odd passages in Matthew, but after the resurrection, Jesus is depicted as being worshipped. And it seems to be his full identity as being more than a mere human being isn't made clear in the stories for the most part. I mean, there are exceptions, until after his resurrection. And that's kind of in line with the way Karl Barth reads these matters. For Barth, revelation and resurrection are cognate concepts. Resurrection is about revelation. And resurrection really reveals Jesus in the fullness of his identity. I mean, Frei might have made a point like that in the identity book, but he didn't. He follows the Troutian line that he saw in H. Richard Niebuhr of this, it's closer to a moral Christology, a moral identity of Jesus and God, than a metaphysical one. I don't like those categories that much, but is Jesus in himself someone who has divine status? And I mean, I don't see how Jesus is properly the object of worship unless he's more than merely a human being. Yeah.
Point. Do you think it? What do you make of the distinction between saying that Jesus was resurrected from the dead and that you can't conceive of this identity as not being resurrected from the dead? In other words, there's an Anselmic point here, right?
Yeah, that's a tricky argument. It's not as crystal clear as it might seem. I think there's a hidden if clause in there in Frei's Anselmian moment that it's not in Anselm. For Anselm, it's analytical. It's not a synthetic judgment. And I would have to have a better grasp of what I once remember thinking about this, but if Jesus is raised from the dead and present to us in the way that Frei thinks, then you could have that Anselmian element. But that if clause makes it non-Anselmian, because for Anselm, it's more of an analytical judgment than a synthetic judgment. I can't document that as clearly as I would like. I'm kind of stumbling over my shoelaces, but that's what I remember thinking some years ago.
Would you all join me in thanking George Hunsinger?